Hi and welcome. I'm Steve Martirano, and this is the Behavioral Corner. You're invited to hang with us as we discuss the ways we live today, the choices we make, the things we do, and how they affect our health and well-being. So you're on the corner, the Behavioral Corner. Please hang around a while. Hey everybody, welcome to the corner. Hanging with yours truly, Steve Martirano. What we do here on the corner is that if we're fortunate, somebody interesting comes by, and we have a conversation. Behavioral health. So think about that. The way we behave has an impact, an enormous impact on our emotional, spiritual, physical, psychological well-being. So that's what we are all about when we say we're talking about behavioral health. So stick around. We as always, we ran into somebody really interesting here on the corner. Liz Spikol is a renowned writer and columnist in the Philadelphia area, having written for many, many years for all kinds of periodicals, from Philadelphia Weekly to Philadelphia Magazine, as well as the paper of record, the Philadelphia Inquirer. Liz joins us because many years ago she found her niche in writing, and it was about her specific battle with the disease that dare not say its name, mental illness. So we're real happy to have Liz Spikol with us here on the corner. Hi, Liz.
Hey, Steve. Good to be here.
It's our pleasure. So I characterize mental illness as the disease that dare not speak its name. Of all the things that can plague us, from substance abuse to, organic diseases and everything, mental illness still is up against this notion that you're better off not talking about having mental issues. Is that your experience? Is that what you still see happening?
Absolutely. I think it scares people. So I think a lot of the time what we see as discrimination and reaction against people who have mental health problems is because other people who don't have those problems are afraid. I live in Philadelphia, it's a big city, when there's not COVID, I do things like take the bus or the subway, and, you just see how people interact with other people who aren't behaving conventionally. And so if let's say there's somebody talking to themselves on the bus or something, you'll notice that nobody sits next to that person.
Yeah, right.
Despite the fact that person might not be doing anything other than just having a conversation with themselves. But it's like there's something about unpredictable behavior and behavior that we don't have an answer for that really disconcerts people. Sure. And makes them ill at ease.
Yeah.
So I think that's a big factor in the way that people react to mental health.
Yeah, I agree. You see it all the time.
Mental illness.
It's almost as though you think you can catch it.
Right, exactly.
Let me move away from this because I don't want to be around it. Tell us about your background and your history, particularly when you first began exhibiting difficulties with your mental condition. Talk about that a little bit.
I had my issues as kids do growing up, but there was nothing profound that plagued me. I had undiagnosed ADD, and so I always lost my homework, and one time came home without my winter coat. I had lost my winter coat. I was like a very forgetful, dreamy kind of kid, but I didn't have any mood issues or anything. So everything went well, and I had a successful high school career and, got into the college of my choice, and everything seemed to be sort of following a rather boring but acceptable path. And then the summer after I graduated from high school, I went to the Dominican Republic for a language immersion program. And while I was there, I was raped. And I did not understand it at the time, but what happened to me as a result of the rape was I suffered from very severe PTSD. At that time, though, this was in 1986, and PTSD wasn't really even a part of our lingo at that time, so there were things that they would call rape trauma syndrome and stuff like that, but it was really poorly understood compared to now. So I started having hallucinations and delusions and fears, and it should be said I was a 17-year-old who was raped by somebody in the house where I lived, who I had to continue living with until I came back to the States maybe a month later. So some of my feeling fearful, that wasn't irrational, but I definitely had a sort of what I now understand is a pretty typical trauma response. So that was the first time that I ever felt like my brain or my mind was betraying me.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember saying to my boyfriend at the time, I would have nightmares and wake up screaming. And I remember saying to him, poor kid, he was 16, do you think I'm crazy? And I didn't even really know what crazy meant, but I just sort of thought that that's where I was headed. And he said, maybe. And I just thought, oh no, but it was so poor. I didn't have any experience with it. And so I went to graduate school after that. And the following 10 years basically were, I did get my master's degree, but I basically was, in and out of hospitals on dozens of medications, got so many diagnoses, mental health diagnoses. I was in, there were suicide attempts, there were shock treatments, had to drop out of school, went on disability, lost jobs. It was a nightmare of unending misery, of clinical depression and psychosis, and diagnosed with bipolar disorder, then schizoaffective disorder, then back to bipolar disorder, then obsessive compulsive disorder, then general anxiety disorder. And it was just, it was relentless trying to find the right medications, the right doctors. So it really was a harrowing 10 years of severe mental illness that took me out of my life and out of society in a lot of ways.
Yeah. Did you report the rape at the time?
I did not, because I believed, as so many, I shouldn't say female, but so many victims do,
mm-hmm.
I thought that it was my fault.
Right.
So I remember that my little boyfriend at the time wanted to tell somebody. He said, we have to tell the teachers. And I said, no, we can't tell anybody. We can't tell anybody. I was completely ashamed. And I just thought, I obviously did something to bring this upon myself.
It's worth remembering how we have a ways to go, but the difference between how rape was dealt with both by the victim and by society at large in 1986 is vastly different than it is today. This is a traumatic event, among the most traumatic events for any young person. Do you think it created the illness in you, or do you think it triggered something that might have occurred anyway?
That's a very good question, and it's one that I think is unanswerable to a large extent. For a long time, there was sort of a consensus among my doctors that the trauma triggered a biological predisposition to bipolar disorder. However, that was sort of reversed years later when the bipolar disorder diagnosis was sort of taken away. And after my years of identifying myself as bipolar, but then saying actually on second thought, this doesn't really look like bipolar. At this point, what I sort of understand is I certainly did have attention deficit disorder. I certainly did have PTSD. I certainly had personality issues that were formed by, there was some childhood trauma. And certainly, things that we become people, right? Or complicated people with, it's just impossible to tell.
Yeah. It also doesn't matter.
It sort of doesn't matter. I mean, I took a little bit of comfort for a while in this notion that, I would have had it anyway.
Right.
But then in more recent years, I thought, you know what? I don't think so. I think if I had not been raped, I don't know that I would have gone down that road.
Yeah.
But so.
Yeah. Liz Spikol is our guest. She's a writer, and she's written extensively on her struggles with mental illness, and has done a great service in doing that because she's been so frank and forthcoming as she is with us right now. Liz, let me ask you about some of these diagnoses that you get over the years. Do you think sometimes in being in front of a therapist or a medical professional with the problems you were exhibiting, that they look for a label for it so that they then can treat the label? I guess what I'm asking you, did you believe at the time, and do you believe now that you were bipolar?
So I think what happens, all medicine is imprecise to a certain extent, but psychiatric illnesses are perhaps even more so, because if you're diabetic, it's pretty obvious from a blood test what your insulin resistance is and that kind of thing. So we don't have blood tests. We don't have strong markers yet, though I think we're getting closer, for severe mental illnesses, and even less so for personality disorders or for sort of lesser mental illnesses or mental conditions. It is a complicated diagnostically. Mm-hmm. And I think what's happened is that there are things that sort of trend and that come into vogue and go out of vogue. And a lot of it gets determined by what's in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the DSM,
yep.
What insurance companies require, what big pharma markets and how they market things, and how doctors embrace the marketing. There are all of these forces that go into sort of making an illness. So for example, there's a history of the illness schizophrenia, which was seen as like a white disease early on in the 60s, when there was a lot of the late 50s, 60s. There's a lot of civil rights activity. You saw schizophrenia being marketed by medical companies and also changing in the DSM to be more of a black disease, because it was like they were sort of applying these words to address a behavior, unruly behavior,
yep.
resistant behavior. So all of these social forces come into play, like the way that homosexuality used to be in the DSM as an illness. So all of these things have an impact. And bipolar disorder in the 1990s, when I was interacting the most frequently with the mental health system, was very, very much in vogue as a diagnosis. It was like the diagnosis du jour, and there was a profusion of medications that were created and marketed, despite the fact that sometimes they were just reformulations of the same thing, but that were marketed to bipolar disorder specifically. So when I think about when I first got that diagnosis, I think the doctor who was giving it to me was very much influenced by what was happening in the culture at large and in his field. I also think I was experiencing symptoms of a mood disorder, so it wasn't unusual as a diagnosis. And at the time, it felt very right to me, certainly, and I believed it to be the correct diagnosis for many years, although I see now that I think it probably was not the right diagnosis.
Yeah. Anybody who's followed this with a little bit of curiosity can remember everything you just described about the changing attitudes and the voguishness of making everything a pathology. I remember a book called The Myth of Mental Illness from the middle 60s, where the proposition was there's no such thing as mental illness. There's just people that don't conform, and maybe we should empty out all of the institutions and just let them function. There's some crazy stuff going on. So to swing it back to how someone like yourself who struggles with mental illness tries to get their life back together, and you're in the hands of these professionals. I mean, you're there to try to get help, and then they describe what's happening to you, and then automatically there's some medicine that you should be taking. What kind of meds have you been on over your struggles?
Oh my gosh. I have been on so many, but there are people who identify as, they call themselves psychiatric survivors, and they feel like the mental health system failed them, and that they were taken advantage of in some ways. I don't feel that way. I feel like I was interacting with a lot of really good practitioners who meant well and who wanted to do the best by me. And I had very recalcitrant symptoms that were unfortunately sometimes exacerbated by the medicines that I took. And so then that confuses the picture too, so you start taking these medications that affect your mood changes, you exhibit more symptoms, and the symptoms are sort of chalked up to like, oh, well, it's the illness as opposed to the medication. So I've been on every kind of mood stabilizer, every kind of seizure medication, every antipsychotic, every antidepressant. I mean, there isn't really a psychiatric medication on the market that I haven't been on, except for some that are more recent. So I'm always pleased when I hear about one that I haven't been on, because I think like,
well, at least I'm not there
progress.
yet. You're right.
I am off of almost all of those medications now. So, and I've been doing much better. For me, being on medications for me that work are, I take something for ADD, and I take like a tiny little bit of a benzo at night for sleep, but that's it. And that's been the case for a few years now. So for me, I was on antipsychotics for almost 20 years, and it's really, really hard on your body.
Yeah. Liz Spikol, a writer, is with us talking about her long struggle with mental illness and the various hoops one must jump through. We really appreciate this. She does a great job of demystifying this entire process. We're on the Behavioral Corner. I hope you're hanging with us.
Studies show that 2020 has negatively affected the mental health of millions of Americans. That is why at Retreat, we work to provide comprehensive mental health programming through our Synergy Health programs. To learn more about Synergy and the comprehensive mental and behavioral health services we offer, call us today at 855-802-6600.
What was the impact on your family, and how bad was it for them?
For the worst of the illness, I was living in Texas and studying comparative literature, which I always say is a combination that could make anybody crazy. But at a certain point, I eventually had to come home to Philadelphia for treatment. And at that point, my parents I was not able to take care of myself. And, my parents just had to switch into it's like they had an adult daughter who was off doing graduate school. They were empty nesters, and then all of a sudden they have a daughter who's back and who needs like round the clock care and supervision and intervention. And it was just, I don't know that my mother slept for 7 years. It was exhausting for them. Mm-hmm. They did everything that they could do. They were extremely supportive of me always. My mother always says now that she feels lucky because I was relatively compliant as a patient. Like if a doctor, I had like a little bit of a worship thing about doctors. And so if a doctor told me to do something, I did it. I was never resistant, to trying medications or interventions. She never had to really fight with me.
Yeah. Were you ever institutionalized involuntarily?
Not involuntarily, no. And I always either voluntarily admit myself or come around to the idea that, yeah, okay, I'll go ahead with this and sign what needs to be signed. So I was really quite tractable always. I always have been.
Well, it's sort of a double-edged sword there, that if you're very good at being, I don't know how to say this, very good at being mentally ill, you're liable to be mentally ill longer than you have to be.
Right. And I think I was lucky to ultimately get a doctor who I still see now, who had a different philosophy. So he's a psychiatrist, but his philosophy is like, we need to do the work of psychotherapy. So that's a huge chunk of it. And also we need to forget about labels, which is a very unusual position for a psychiatrist to take. But he felt that sort of the DSM, all of the labeling and the insurance codes, and it had all gone crazy. So, his attitude was just tell me what's going on. Tell me what your symptoms are. We'll address the symptoms so you can have a better life, and let's not get caught up in the name of the illness, because once you get caught up in that, then that really does spiral.
Yeah. And that's what you're chasing then, that thing, rather than what you mentioned as the goal to get a balanced life, a functioning and relatively happy life. When did you start to have confidence that you were managing your mental illness?
That's a good question. I would say in the 2000s, in the early-ish aughts, I felt like I had really started to manage things better.
Were you ever violent?
Yes, I was. I was violent to it's hard to talk about because I feel guilty about it. But I was violent to people in my life, like my ex-husband, and I was violent to my pets, which I feel worse about than the ex-husband, to tell you the truth. And I was violent sort of more generally to some property.
Uh-huh.
I did some property damage.
Yeah. I'll tell you why I asked, because recently you had a piece. In Philadelphia, we had another tragic example of police responding to a domestic disturbance where there was understood to be some underlying mental issues. They were felt they were being threatened by a guy with a knife, and the result is another shooting to death of the fellow with the knife who had mental health issues. And I know you wrote an article saying that you have been in situations, maybe not exactly comparable to that, where you were looked at as a physical threat, and you didn't get shot 14 times.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we're not trying to make the point about, any because not all shootings are the same, but there's a situation where police are now more often than not being called upon to react in a situation where a mental health expert is needed. Is any work being done that you're aware of to make that a more seamless proposition?
I'm not aware of work being done. I'm aware of talk. But, this has been an issue basically, since deinstitutionalization happened. The whole idea behind, and which was a good thing, and the whole idea behind deinstitutionalization was if you take people out of these institutions and you make them less reliant on that system, they will excel in many cases. But in the cases where they don't, we're going to offer them community-based supports that are better for them because you're not warehousing people. You're supporting them in the community. This is all like a wonderful idea, and it has been very successful in many ways. And I think has really returned a lot of the autonomy to people who in past decades would have just been shut away forever. Unfortunately, though, our society, depending on lots of different things, doesn't always invest sufficiently in community resources. So, community mental health and education pertaining to mental health and trauma-informed services and all of this stuff that we talk about as being like, well, this is what's good to support people who have chronic mental health issues. There's not always money for that that's invested. And so what you end up with is a situation where the police are responding to a lot of calls and concerns that really they're not trained for. I mean, law enforcement, they have minimal training. And even people who are highly trained in crisis intervention from a mental health perspective, it's a very challenging situation.
Yeah.
So now there was a time when it was very much in vogue for everybody was talking about Memphis, Tennessee, because Memphis did a wonderful job of instituting this crisis intervention team in their police department. And so then everybody talked about the Memphis model, and they wanted to sort of go along with the Memphis model. Philadelphia, also at a certain point adopted a variation of the Memphis model. Crisis intervention officers didn't make it mandatory. There were a lot of, there's been a lot of mixed reviews with incorporating this into traditional law enforcement training. But there are programs now that we see are very innovative, that are sort of like CIT, but are very innovative and that can be used, to where you can have people who respond to a mental health emergency who are not law enforcement.
Yeah.
They're people who know how to handle it, and there are other sort of safety valves, because it's not really fair to have people with mental health problems interacting with law enforcement and assuming that is going to go well.
Yeah, exactly.
It's not.
Exactly. Hey, Liz, you're managing this situation. Mental illness is something that folks can live with and manage. I don't. There's no vaccine for that, of course. Nevertheless, having said that, are there situations and things you have to avoid in order to keep an even keel?
much. I mean, the age that I'm at now, I'm in my early 50s, and there is some evidence to suggest that these types of illnesses do abate somewhat in later years. Certainly, that's been the case for me. I really don't experience symptoms very often at all. If anything, I experience fear that I will, but I've been really stable for many years now and haven't been hospitalized for, it might be 20 years now since I've been hospitalized. So, for mental illness. So, I would say that like any person who has a history of trauma, I'm not going to watch The Accused tomorrow, movie about rape, but say I have a very demanding job as an editorial director of a media company. And like, what I want people to understand is whatever diagnosis you get, whatever label it is, whatever symptoms you have, it's not forever. You can live with things and manage them and have a successful life.
Liz, thanks so much for your time and for your work. It's really, I'm telling you, it's great. This is a curtain that needs to be fully pulled back so that people can confront it. It's not a small problem. It's not getting any smaller either. So thanks so much for your time here with us on The Corner, and stay happy.
Thank you. You too.
That's it for now. And make us a habit, hanging out at the Behavioral Corner. And when we're not hanging, follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter on the Behavioral Corner.